Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I will present you a project that is a part of a bigger cross-sectional study we did in Canada a few years ago, and it's about biosecurity practices. So the national standard was a document created by many stakeholders from the Canadian dairy industry, and it involves government and dairy farmers, vets, and academia. And the goal of this document was to implement industry-wide biosecurity practices in order to reduce the risk and the pressure of infection on dairy farms. And the targeted outcomes were separated in many themes, 4 of them. So animal health management, animal addition and movement, sanitation, and human and equipment movement. And even though there were already a few studies in the world that looked at adoption of dairy practices, we didn't have information on what was done in Canadian dairy farms. And, great. Okay. And in order to remedy to this gap, we decided to do a national study to describe the current adoption of biosecurity practices on Canadian dairy farm, but also to identify demographic variables that are associated with the adoption of these practices. So there was a national dairy study that was made in 2015 and is described in a paper already published. And the questionnaires were in 2 parts. The first part was voluntary participation, and there was an invitation sent to all Canadian dairy farmers. In the phase 2, there was a subsample that was selected on a stratified random sample. And for what I'm presenting today, the biosecurity practice adoption was mainly described by frequency, but I also did a summary of this adoption by using multiple correspondence analyses. And I also was able to look at association with demographic variables using supplementary variables. I'll show you that later. Hopefully I don't scare you too much. For the results, we had 1,157 respondents that answered the survey. There was, in 2015, about 12,000 Canadian dairy farmers, so that's about a 10% response rate. And then for the phase 2, there was a sample size calculation made, so we had 368 respondents. I will not tell which questions was for which survey in the next part of this presentation because it would make it very complicated, but it will be published eventually, hopefully. So just to describe the population, it's very similar to what we have in Canada at the moment. So almost 60% were tie stall housing and 42% freestall housing. And the size of the herd are distributed about like the same distribution as we have in Canada. So a third is over 100 milking cows, and then a quarter between 66 and 100 cows, and then the rest is smaller than 65 milking cows. And the age of the respondents, most of them were between 30 and 50 years old, and again, most of them had a college degree. So the first theme of the national practice is animal health management. And as it was already published in a few studies, most of the respondents kept health records, which is very interesting. But what I found also quite special is that almost 2/3 of the respondents had written SOPs. There were a few studies published recently saying that SOPs have a positive impact on other health, and it's probably why it was implemented so commonly on our farms. And you have here the SOPs that were used by the respondents, and mastitis was the first one by far. In the questions associated with separating the at-risk animals or at-risk group of animals, I think the least adopted one was the housing of sick and lame cow in calving pens, and only a quarter would actually never do it. Means that most of the farm would still house their sick cows in calving pens. However, when we asked them if the newborns were nursing the dam, half of them would actually never do it. And using different needle for every treatment, more than a half would always change needle between treatment. One of the big one that was interesting in that part also was the investigation of general syndromes. You know, when something happens and you don't really know what caused it, like abortion or unexplained death, most of the respondents did not investigate. So only 37% investigated high abortion prevalence, and then 22% did the PM examination on dead animal. And here, even like 44% had animals with unknown cause of death. So it's not that they all knew what was happening. The second theme of the national practice is the animal addition and movement. And I think this one has been reported before also. 55% of the respondents considered their herd closed, but we also asked questions as, do you bring animals from other herds? Do you buy animals? And do you have animals leaving the herd and coming back? And with these answers, we saw that 38% actually had a closed herd. And there was another study published, I reckon, in Europe, that looked at animal movement, and it's even lower. It's probably around 12% that actually have closed herds. So we're not different from anyone there. But then we also asked respondents if their animals had direct contact with other animals, and a third of them had reported contact with other farm animals or wildlife, and more than 2/3 of them had pets, like farm dogs or farm cats. When we asked them which strategies so that's for the open herds, not the closed herds. When we asked them what strategy they would adopt for dealing with the movement of animals on their farm, as you can see, a quarter had no strategy for new animals on their farm, and then half of them would have no strategy for returning cattle. So that means if an animal is left for hospital or for show, they would come back and have no strategy really. And even though the numbers are different, it's the same trend, right? So the vaccination would be the strategy the most adopted by farmers, and then quarantine is quite low, and testing for diseases was even lower. The third theme was sanitation on farm, and this one is a little bit more brief, but we asked them if the respondents were using the same equipment to handle manure or feed, and most of them, almost 2/3, never did. However, if you ask them how they were keeping the calving pen or the cow around calving clean, then there was still a very low number that would never clean or never ensure the cow was clean on their farm. And then the always part is also relatively low. Last question we asked in that section was about carcass disposal, and most of them were burying, composting, removing with a licensed dead stock collector, incinerating the animals, and we have winter in Canada, so also frozen until summer and then disposed appropriately. However, a lot of them, and not a lot, about 1% of them answered other, and we asked them what other meant. And there was still some of them that would feed them to scavenger or pets, or leave them in the woods for whatever happens. So there's still a small percentage that is not complying to the regulation. Finally, we asked about human and equipment movement. And as you can see, there's a lot of red on this slide. So there was very, very minimal adoption of biosecurity practices for human movement. Only 3% of the respondents had a gated main entrance. 40% had biosecurity signage, and 4% would lock the barn's door if no one was in the farm. almost no visitor log, and they did not require the visitors to wear clean or farm-designated boots or coveralls. So very, very limited action taken to minimize the risk associated with human coming to your farm. However, a little bit better, still less than half, would have equipment for their employees, so farm-designated footwear or coveralls, but better than for the visitors. Okay, association. I don't want to scare you here. I use multiple correspondent analysis, and there was 61 dimension to that analysis, but I will present only dimension 1 and 2. So the axes are dimension 1 on the x-axis and then dimension 2 on the y-axis. And every category is positioned with the correlation coefficient of the category with the dimension. So if you look at unique needle use, if it's high on the dimension 2, it means that this category has influence on that dimension, but that every respondent in that area would be more likely to never use a unique needle between animals. On the other hand, if a respondent is in the negative pole of the dimension 2, they would be more likely to always use a different needle. So dimension 1, so this one, respondents that were moving on that axis would have difference in addition of cattle to the herd practices and new animals, and then footwear and coveralls for visitors. For the dimension 2, footwear and coveralls for employees, and then animal health management, such as health record, review of disease or occurrence, post-mortem examination, and unique use of needle, like I showed you here. What's interesting with that is you can graph every single respondent according to another variable that is not taken account by the multiple correspondence analysis. And like here, every dot is a respondent, and their color is according to their housing, for example. And as you can see, I think it's quite obvious. The blue points are more in the positive pole of the dimension 2, and the red points are more in the negative pole of the dimension 2. And there is, I'm not sure you see well, but there is the barycenter of all the respondents in blue and the barycenter of the respondents in red. And as you can see, the 95% ellipse around it are not overlapping. So it means that these respondents are actually different in the second dimension of the multiple correspondence analysis. And we saw something similar with the herd size. So the large herds, over 100 milking cows, were different from medium, small, and very small herds, which are overlapping. So there is a difference in their characteristic and in their adoption of biosecurity practices. So regardless of the complicated graph, we found a difference. And I did not show you here, but there was also a difference in geographical region. So the main conclusions we found from these descriptive data is that most biosecurity practices have not been widely adopted in Canada, and adoption of biosecurity practices were associated with some demographic variables, such as geographical region, type of housing, and herd size. And this is important for us because the adoption of biosecurity practices need to be promoted in Canada, and implementation and promotion of these biosecurity practice is likely to need a personalized approach according to who you want to talk to, small farms, big farms. And then we can also use the descriptive data for benchmarking for farms, which is a motivational promoter usually. With that, I would like to thank the Dairy Cluster 2 that was funding this project, but also all the farms that answered those surveys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.